I was sitting at my desk at 2:13 on a Wednesday afternoon when Gavin Holt from Human Resources walked into my office with a security officer standing right behind him. The officer was Hank Lawson, a quiet man who had worked security at the facility for nearly 2 decades. Hank looked down at the linoleum floor, adjusting his belt strap, clearly uncomfortable with the task he had been assigned. I had been sitting at that exact same desk for 24 years. Same steel frame, same faded gray laminate, same rectangular window overlooking the north parking lot. Over nearly a quarter of a century, I had learned the rhythm of that facility better than anyone alive. I knew every vehicle that belonged to every shift worker. I knew which overhead sodium lights in Lot B would flicker on freezing winter nights. I knew the exact metallic rattle the primary rooftop HVAC unit made just before its secondary compressor cycled off. And I knew by the precise angle of late afternoon sunlight cutting across the concrete wall that it was far too early in the day for anyone from Human Resources to be paying a friendly visit. Gavin Holt did not sit down. He stepped up to the edge of my desk, his posture rigid, and set a thick manila folder directly on top of my open logbook. "Vance, we need to talk," Gavin said, his voice flat and deliberate. "My name is Vance Miller. I am 49 years old. For 24 continuous years, I was the senior systems engineer tasked with keeping the automation machinery running at Vanguard Industrial Systems, a mid-sized precision manufacturing plant located on the outskirts of Indianapolis. We manufactured high-tolerance structural components for automotive assemblies and commercial aerospace supply chains. Our facility ran 3 continuous manufacturing lines, employing 800 workers across 2 operational shifts. Controlling the entire operation was a complex SCADA network that tied together 47 programmable logic controller nodes. The entire network had been customized piecemeal over 15 years, leaving massive documentation gaps extending all the way back to 2009. By the end, I was the only systems engineer left in the entire building. Gavin cleared his throat and gestured toward the folder. He explained that executive leadership had received a formal internal compliance flag. Someone in management had reported seeing my personal pickup truck parked near the regional office of Apex Automation Group on 3 consecutive Saturday mornings. Apex was a regional automation equipment builder and systems integrator that supplied precision component hardware throughout the Midwest, including to Vanguard. Gavin leaned forward, setting his palms on the edge of my desk. He stated that the company had reasonable cause to believe I was sharing proprietary operational methodologies with a competitor in violation of corporate policy. Standing silently in the far corner of my office was Garrett Ross, the chief compliance officer. Garrett was the kind of administrator who usually relished these moments, yet today he seemed strangely hesitant, leaning against the filing cabinet with his arms crossed and his eyes avoiding mine. I did not raise my voice or launch into an immediate defense. I did not point out that Apex Automation Group was an equipment vendor, not a competitor in aerospace manufacturing. I did not explain that I had been doing independent, off-hours weekend advisory work for Apex, reviewing their newly proposed hardware calibration specifications. I had touched no operational Vanguard data. Furthermore, under federal copyright protections, under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106, the adaptive calibration framework I was reviewing was proprietary intellectual property I had authored entirely on my personal time during off-hours, without utilizing company equipment or receiving per diem travel compensation. I had maintained meticulous written logs of every single weekend session specifically to prevent any potential conflict of interest. I looked at Gavin, then transferred my gaze to Garrett in the corner, and then looked back down at the manila folder sitting on my desk. "Understood," I said quietly. Both men waited, expecting me to plead my case or demand a union representative. Instead, I reached up, unclipped my magnetic security access badge from my collar, and placed it neatly on top of the manila folder. "I will gather my personal belongings," I added, "to understand how a major manufacturing facility could collapse 3 days later. You have to understand how Vanguard had systematically hollowed out its technical foundation. When I was hired 24 years ago, the systems engineering department had 3 full-time engineers. Having 3 dedicated engineers provided full coverage and allowed for proper documentation. Then came corporate restructuring initiatives. Budget cuts eliminated the junior engineering position, reducing our team to 2. A few years later, my senior colleague accepted a higher-paying position at an automation firm in Michigan, rather than recruiting a replacement. Executive management froze the open requisition indefinitely to meet quarterly margin targets. From that day forward, the entire weight of Vanguard's technical infrastructure rested exclusively on my shoulders. Derek Hayes had been the vice president of operations for 4 years. Derek was a master of corporate terminology, extraordinarily skilled at framing severe budget cuts as strategic optimization. "This is strictly a temporary situation, Vance," Derek would tell me whenever I brought up staffing concerns. "We are simply maintaining a tight holding pattern through the end of Q3. Once the merger evaluation clears, we will fully staff the engineering department." Q3 came and went. No engineers were hired. What did accumulate over those years were missed maintenance windows and critical vulnerability reports I submitted to management. Every time I identified a potential single point of failure in our SCADA network, I logged it formally. Time after time, those reports came back stamped with the exact same administrative tag. Acknowledged. Low priority. The breaking point occurred on a rainy Tuesday evening in November, roughly 2 years before Gavin walked into my office. It was my son Caleb's 16th birthday. Caleb had chosen his favorite steakhouse, 40 minutes from our house. Dinner was scheduled for 6 o'clock. I cleared my desk and left the plant at 5:15. I made it all the way to my truck in the north parking lot when my emergency pager buzzed. Line 2 had encountered a critical fault sequence within its hydraulic pressure control loop. If the sequence was not manually cleared and recalibrated from the primary terminal, the entire line would lock up mid-run, damaging expensive tooling. Nobody else on shift knew how to execute the manual override. I sat in the cab of my truck in the dark parking lot for 47 minutes with my laptop connected via a remote modem, manually clearing the code line by line. By the time I disconnected and drove to the restaurant, my family was already eating dessert. Caleb looked up when I walked into the dining room. He did not say anything, but I saw the flash of disappointment that crossed his face before he turned his attention back to his cake. I never forgot that look. It was the precise moment I realized what I had become to Vanguard Industrial Systems. I was not an indispensable asset, I was merely an available utility. Being indispensable means an organization recognizes your value and builds a sustainable structure around you. Being available means management knows you are the only person who can fix their mistakes, but they cannot be bothered to allocate resources to support you. The final attempt I made to fix Vanguard's organizational structure occurred the following October. I prepared a comprehensive technical presentation, complete with equipment failure metrics, safety benchmarks, and logs of 3 recent near-miss production outages. I scheduled a 40-minute meeting with Derek Hayes, Garrett Ross, and the Senior Plant Operations Committee. My proposal was straightforward: hire 4 additional engineers with defined specializations to establish a robust rotation. Derek Hayes nodded attentively throughout the presentation. When I finished, he folded his hands and smiled smoothly. "We appreciate the thorough analysis, Vance," Derek said. "We will certainly revisit this staffing model right after we close Q4. However, as Garrett pointed out, our primary focus right now must remain on immediate margin optimization." Garrett Ross added that in his opinion, the underlying operational friction was probably due to technical documentation gaps rather than insufficient headcount. I packed up my laptop and walked out of that conference room, knowing with absolute clarity that management would never hire support. That afternoon, I made a firm personal decision. I would no longer sacrifice my health or my family for a company that viewed system stability as an afterthought. A few weeks later, I traveled to Chicago for an international industrial automation conference. Vanguard was not funding the trip. Corporate travel budgets had been frozen for 18 months. However, the conference chairman was a former colleague who invited me to deliver a guest lecture on adaptive system calibration frameworks. a methodology I had developed independently over years of solving complex automation challenges. Vanguard was more than happy to list my presentation in trade publications for free corporate publicity, though no one in executive leadership inquired whether I required hotel compensation or per diem expenses. That conference was where I met Vaughn Mercer. Vaughn was the director of engineering at Apex Automation Group. After my session concluded, Vaughn walked straight down the center aisle, extended his hand, and spoke with direct professional clarity. "The mathematical logic behind your calibration framework is extraordinary," Vaughn said. "I would genuinely like to understand how you structured the secondary feedback loops." We sat in the hotel conference center for 4 hours. It was a purely professional engineering conversation. At the end of our conversation, Vaughn handed me his business card and offered a daily consulting rate that exceeded what I earned in a full week at Vanguard to review their newly posed equipment integration specifications. Before accepting, I carefully reviewed my Vanguard employment agreement 3 separate times. Apex was an equipment vendor, not a competitor. To ensure complete transparency, I kept meticulous written logs of every weekend session, detailing dates, topics, duration, and attendees. For 8 continuous weeks, I lived on 2 parallel tracks. From Monday through Friday, I maintained Vanguard's 3 production lines single-handedly. On Saturdays, I sat in a bright conference room at Apex, collaborating with engineers who valued technical precision. Then came the Wednesday afternoon ambush. After placing my security badge on Gavin Holt's folder, I packed my personal belongings into a cardboard box. My coffee mug, a spare work glove missing since March, and a technical notebook filled with hand-drawn SCADA loop diagrams that no one else in the building knew how to interpret. Hank Lawson walked beside me as I exited the building. He held open the heavy glass lobby door and offered a simple nod as I stepped out into the afternoon air. It was the most genuine gesture of respect anyone at Vanguard had shown me in years. I placed the box on the seat of my truck and looked back at the facility. My mobile phone buzzed in the cup holder with a text from Vaughn Mercer. "Still available for our Monday strategy session?" I typed back, "Yes, available full-time now if the position is open." Vaughn's reply arrived in less than 60 seconds. "The position is yours. See you Monday morning at 8. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward home. Halfway there, I pulled into a quiet gas station, bought a coffee, and sat in my truck with the window rolled down for 15 minutes. There were no emergency pager alerts. There was only the gentle hum of highway traffic. That night, I slept for 8 solid, uninterrupted hours. When I woke up the next morning and saw 6:42 on the clock without an alarm, it took my mind a moment to process the absolute absence of dread. Monday morning at Apex Automation Group represented a total shift in professional environment. Vaughn Mercer met me in the lobby personally and introduced me to my new team, 5 dedicated systems engineers, each possessing a clear, defined area of specialization. One of the senior engineers, Trevor Mills, stood up from his desk as soon as I entered. On his desk was a printed copy of my Chicago presentation, filled with red ink notes in the margins. "I have been reviewing your tolerance calibration model," Trevor said directly. "I think the feedback loop breaks down when cycle times drop below 4 seconds. Walk me through your equations." I looked at his notes. His mathematical critique was sharp and well-founded. "Pull up the whiteboard," I said. "Show me your calculations." We spent the next 2 hours analyzing equations at the board. By noon, we had developed an improved iteration of the calibration model. I had forgotten what true engineering collaboration felt like. It was not about putting out fires. It was about building superior systems alongside professionals who respected the craft. While I was settling into my new role at Apex, across town, Vanguard Industrial Systems was beginning to unravel. I did not need internal reports to know what was happening inside that plant. Every Tuesday evening at precisely 7:30, the primary SCADA server initiated an automated database calibration cycle. Because of an uncorrected software bug dating back to 2009, that automated cycle caused a memory leak that would freeze the control network unless a qualified engineer performed a manual override sequence from the main terminal. For years, I had executed that override sequence every single Tuesday night without fail. I had submitted 3 separate technical requests urging management to patch the code. Each request had been categorized as low priority and ignored. There was no one left to perform the override now. On Tuesday evening at 8:15, my phone buzzed while I was sitting on the porch watching a baseball game with Caleb. The caller ID displayed Derek Hayes' direct office line. I let it ring through to voicemail. A minute later, I listened to Derek's message. The smooth confidence was noticeably absent, replaced by a tight, forced composure. "Hey Vance, it's Derek," the message began. "We are seeing some unusual feedback behavior on the control network tonight. It looks like a minor configuration glitch on line 2. Give me a quick call when you get this so we can clear it up." I deleted the voicemail and went back to watching the game with my son. By Wednesday morning, the situation had escalated. My phone logged 4 missed calls from plant managers, followed by an urgent voicemail from Clara, the executive assistant to the chief executive officer, offering emergency consulting terms. I replied with a single concise text message, currently focused on one company, as suggested during my termination. By Thursday morning, the consequences of Vanguard's failure became public knowledge. The unaddressed memory leak on Tuesday night had triggered a total SCADA communications blackout across all 3 production lines at 2 in the morning. With no senior engineer to diagnose the failure, automated hydraulic valves on line 1 locked open, blowing out primary manifold seals and flooding assembly areas. Lines 2 and 3 automatically shut down as safety interlocks triggered. 800 assembly workers were sent home while the plant sat dark. Vanguard missed 3 major delivery windows for aerospace components, triggering severe financial penalty clauses under their supply contracts. On Thursday at 11:40 in the morning, I received a direct phone call from Grant Caldwell, the chairman of Vanguard's board of directors. His voice on the line carried the profound exhaustion of an executive dealing with catastrophic financial damage. Grant informed me that following an emergency board meeting that morning, executive leadership had been thoroughly restructured. Derek Hayes, Gavin Holt, and Garrett Ross had all been relieved of their duties, effective immediately. Grant explained that the board had conducted an independent audit of my employment file and discovered the extensive folder of submitted technical warnings that had sat unread in the corporate shared drive for 14 months, tagged as low priority. "The board recognizes that severe systemic failures led to your improper departure," Grant said. "We would like to request an immediate in-person meeting to discuss your return as Chief Technical Officer." I sat at my desk at Apex, recalling a comment Trevor Mills had made the previous afternoon while capping his dry erase markers. "The most powerful move in a situation like this is returning strictly on your own terms, solving the crisis with absolute precision and leaving them with a permanent record of what they threw away." Trevor had noted. I thought about Trevor's words and addressed Grant Caldwell directly. "I will not meet in person, Grant," I said clearly, "and I will not return as an employee. If Vanguard requires my technical assistance, it will be executed under an independent master consulting agreement subject to 6 non-negotiable conditions. First, my consulting rate is $400 per hour with a mandatory 3-day minimum commitment payable in advance. That is $9,600 wired directly to my account before I initiate a single command. Second, the engagement will be strictly remote. I will not step foot inside Vanguard's physical plant under any circumstances. Third, I will act exclusively as an instructing authority. Vanguard's remaining technical staff will execute every command under my direct verbal instruction, ensuring they learn the architecture. Fourth, Vanguard's board of directors must issue an official written corporate acknowledgement stating that I repeatedly flagged these specific SCADA vulnerabilities over an 18-month period and was systematically overruled by former executive management. Fifth, under the principles of the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, the Warner Act, Title 29 of the United States Codes, Section 2101, and state employment standards, all technical staff laid off over the preceding 2 years must receive 6 months of full severance pay and retroactive clean employment references. Sixth, Vanguard must formally establish and fully fund the four-engineer systems team structure I originally proposed, with market-rate compensation tiers. Furthermore, my legal counsel prepared a formal notice detailing that under Title 17 of the United States Code Section 106, all custom SCADA diagnostic scripts authored on my personal time remain my exclusive intellectual property. Any unauthorized attempt by Vanguard technicians to extract those scripts would result in an immediate federal copyright infringement action. Grant paused on the line, then responded, "We accept all 6 conditions. The signed acknowledgement will be provided, and the wire transfer will be initiated immediately." The signed agreement arrived at 3:15 that afternoon. The wire transfer cleared at 3:40. At 4 o'clock, I opened my laptop and initiated the remote session. The technical recovery of Vanguard's manufacturing plant took 3 full intensive days. The technicians remaining on Vanguard's floor were capable individuals. The fundamental problem was that former management had intentionally cultivated a culture where critical operational knowledge was treated as a personal burden rather than a documented corporate asset. I approached the restoration process with methodical precision. On day 1, we focused entirely on restoring core authentication frameworks and rebuilding corrupted PLC credential cycles. Working step by step through the primary terminal, we cleared the memory buffer on line 1, replaced damaged hydraulic manifold assemblies, and successfully brought line 1 back online by 8 p.m. On day 2, we rebuilt the entire SCADA calibration sequence from scratch. I instructed Vanguard's interim technical lead, a capable engineer named Shane, who had been brought in from another division, to open the corporate shared drive. Navigate to the engineering archive folder titled System Risk Assessments. I told Shane over the audio link. Open the document marked SCADA Calibration Protocol dated 14 months ago. There was a long silence over the line as Shane located the file. "Vance," Shane said quietly, "this document contains the exact step-by-step recovery procedure for this specific memory leak fault. It was marked low priority, unread." "I am aware," I replied. "Load the script and execute step 1. By the end of day 2, line 2 was fully recalibrated and running stable test cycles. On day 3, we cleared the remaining interlocking faults on line 3 and restored full production capability by mid-afternoon. Vanguard was able to salvage a partial shipment, but they could not avoid severe financial penalty fees triggered by the 3-day outage. Corporate stock had dropped 22% over the course of the week. Halfway through the second day of remote recovery, former Vice President Derek Hayes unexpectedly logged into the video conference stream. He appeared on screen looking hollowed out, facing potential shareholder litigation for breach of fiduciary duty under state corporate governance laws, for failing to act on documented risk warnings. Derek cleared his throat and started to speak into his microphone. "Vance, I just wanted to say a few words regarding—" "Not now, Derek," I interrupted calmly. "We are currently restoring active production lines. Keep the frequency clear." Derek closed his mouth and muted his microphone. He did not speak again for the remainder of the session. Before closing the final remote session on Friday afternoon, I addressed the entire technical team. 14 technicians and supervisors assembled in Vanguard's primary control room. Every operational vulnerability I flagged over the past 18 months is fully detailed in the documentation folder on your shared drive, I told them. Those reports were ignored by administrators who cared more about short-term metrics than long-term infrastructure. Read those documents. I paused, allowing the weight of the instruction to settle. Read them not because another failure is imminent, I continued, but because your responsibility going forward is to ensure that no single engineer is ever forced to carry an entire facility on their back alone. That is how this disaster happened. Shane cleared his throat and spoke for the team. "We begin implementing the full 4-engineer rotation on Monday morning, Vance." "Thank you." I closed the laptop screen, ending the session. That weekend, my son Caleb drove home from his college campus in Columbus, arriving on Saturday around noon. We ordered pizza, grabbed cold drinks, and turned on the afternoon college football game. I did not check my phone once throughout the entire afternoon. Around 2 hours into the game, Caleb leaned back on the couch with a quiet smile. He had noticed the complete absence of tension in my posture. The realization that for the first time in his life, his father was fully present, unencumbered by the constant threat of an emergency plant call. We did not discuss Vanguard or the board meeting. We simply enjoyed the game together. It was the finest afternoon I had experienced in decades. It was far better than being proven right, far better than the advance consulting payment, and far better than watching Derek Hayes sit silently on a video call. It was simply the quiet joy of being present with my son. That was the intangible cost I had failed to calculate over 24 years of solitary service. 6 weeks after I joined Apex Automation Group on a full-time basis, Vaughn Mercer asked me to present a major strategic initiative to our executive board. The concept for this initiative had been forming in my mind since the week of Vanguard's collapse. Following news coverage of the operational blackout, Apex's corporate office had received 17 direct inquiries from regional manufacturing firms requesting independent operational risk audits. These were manufacturing companies whose leadership had watched Vanguard's public crisis and recognized a terrifyingly familiar vulnerability in their own operations. The single overworked engineer, the unread risk documentation, and critical infrastructure relying entirely on one person's unwritten memory. I drafted a comprehensive business proposal for a new dedicated division within Apex, the Systems Resilience Division. Rather than providing standard equipment maintenance, this division would conduct independent assessments of industrial automation facilities to identify single points of failure before they resulted in public outages. We would audit documentation protocols, evaluate SCADA redundancy, and ensure that no facility operated at the mercy of ignored risk warnings. I completed the full proposal in 3 days. The Apex Executive Board approved the initiative unanimously. We posted job requisitions for 4 senior engineering positions that same week. Within 6 weeks, we assembled an elite team of specialists spanning industrial automation, PLC architecture, SCADA network design, and supply chain continuity. Each position was structured with clear operational boundaries, competitive compensation, and a strict requirement that all system procedures be fully documented. Trevor Mills was appointed as my deputy division lead. He possessed exceptional technical instincts and shared my commitment to eliminating single points of failure in technical architecture. Our first 3 corporate clients came directly from the fallout of Vanguard's failure. Manufacturers who had witnessed the disaster and reached out to Apex before the plant had recovered. Every client engagement followed a consistent pattern. We would walk into a manufacturing facility, request to inspect their primary SCADA documentation, and watch the exact same look of realization cross the faces of executive leadership. The sudden awareness that the documentation they assumed existed was virtually non-existent. By the end of our first full quarter, the Systems Resilience Division had 7 active corporate engagements and 4 additional projects in the contract pipeline. Division revenue significantly exceeded our initial 6-month projections. More importantly, Apex was rapidly establishing an industry-wide reputation as the premier authority that prevented catastrophic failures from occurring. 3 months after Hank Lawson walked me out of Vanguard's lobby for the last time, I returned to Chicago to speak at the annual International Industrial Automation Conference. The circumstances could not have been more different from my previous visit. During my prior appearance, I had been a solitary, exhausted engineer presenting a calibration model I had built alone in my spare time. This time, I stood on the main stage as the director of a rapidly growing division, presenting alongside a talented team of engineers. As I glanced out at the audience during my keynote address, I spotted Derek Hayes sitting in the 3rd row on the left side. He looked noticeably smaller and more subdued than the confident vice president who used to dismiss my staffing requests. Also present in the audience was Elena Cross, the newly appointed chief systems officer whom Vanguard's board had hired to rebuild their technical division. An executive role that should have been created 5 years earlier. Following the conclusion of my session, after the crowd around the podium had dispersed, Elena Cross walked up to shake my hand. "Your archived technical documentation saved Vanguard from total insolvency," Elena said directly. Once our board actually forced management to read your reports, the recovery pathway was clear. How far behind schedule is the facility currently? At least 6 months minimum, I replied factually. Are they actually following the documentation now? They read every page, Elena confirmed, and we are currently building out the exact 4-engineer team structure you originally proposed. We are following your blueprint precisely. I offered a simple, respectful nod. Thank you, Vance, Elena added warmly. Your work set a new standard for our entire industry. I drove home to Indianapolis late that evening along the interstate. The driver's window was cracked slightly, letting in the cool night air as flat Indiana farmland stretched toward the horizon under a clear sky. My mobile phone rested quietly in the cup holder, silent and completely free of emergency alerts. There is a fundamental truth about being the person who carries an organization's invisible weight. After a while, you stop noticing how heavy it is. You calibrate your entire existence around the strain. You accept the midnight calls, the canceled family dinners, and the vacations that never happen because no one else understands how to keep the machinery running. You convince yourself that the situation is temporary, that management will eventually understand, and that if you just hold on a little longer, help will arrive. And then one afternoon, someone sets a folder on your desk. You set your badge down, walk out into the parking lot, and sit in your truck. And suddenly, you feel the weight lift. It was so heavy for so long that you forgot what it felt like to live without it. You thought the burden was a permanent part of who you were. But it was never yours to carry alone. It was simply a load placed upon you by individuals who never bothered to check whether a human being could sustain it indefinitely. 24 years is a long time. It is long enough to forget what engineering felt like before it became an endless exercise in crisis management. What I understand now with absolute clarity is the vital distinction between being needed and being valued. Vanguard needed me the way a heavy building needs a structural load-bearing wall. They could not remove it without collapsing the roof, yet they never gave it a second thought. Until the foundation cracked and the ceiling began to collapse. Apex valued the engineering. They valued the intelligence behind the systems and respected the person executing the work. That distinction changes everything. The ultimate satisfaction in this story was not the plant outage. It was not the 22% drop in corporate stock, the termination of negligent executives, or the contract penalties Vanguard was forced to absorb. Those were simply the natural consequences of corporate hubris. The real victory was everything that came afterward. Every new client our division signed, every technical paper published under my name, every conference keynote delivered alongside my team, and every manufacturer saved from their own operational disaster. The most devastating response to those who underestimate you is not to seek petty revenge. It is simply to step out of their building, reclaim your worth, and never stop building something greater.